behind this.
Yeah, you're hidden behind that.
Good afternoon.
Technology
Thanks
in here.
you all for coming. And we are approaching the end of our Csaaw seminars of this term, but we are also happy that we are getting close to the summer. In the summer we have like nicer discussions where we go to and sit down with professors in a table and eat and drink and have some discussions about complexity. And those are actually really fun. So keep an eye on your emails if you're here in the summer. Those discussions last year they were like incredible. We usually read some books or got some papers or just some idea that we start the conversation and stay there for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours discussing complexity. So keep an eye on that. And today we have Jose Alfaro from third year student in the SNRE, and we are gonna hear from him. So
Good. Thank you, Pablo. So my name is Jose again, and I do highly recommend coming to the summer classes or the summer meetings for Csaaw. They're a lot of fun. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about my work with modeling of energy systems. And I want to set up the stage for you first. This is a back of the napkin thing. This is not ready yet to be finished. So after this, I hope that I have a full notebook of ideas that you guys can provide for me so that I can go back and destroy my agent-based model and build it all over again. Also, pray that you apologize my messing with Prezi. So because this is a more informal presentation, I figured I'd try new software and figure out how it works. And so there's going to be things here that are not completely cited or referenced correctly, so I apologize for that as well. But so having made those disclaimers, let's go ahead and talk about my work, which is planning rural renewable energy systems using agent-based modeling. So I'll tell you a little bit about what my objective is with my model and with my work. We'll talk a little bit about the energy models that are out there, talk about my methods, and then we'll give you some preliminary results and talk a little bit about what the future work is going to be and what the conclusions are that I have so far. I am actually not sharing the time slot today, so I'm going to try to go slowly so that I can get the most out of your minds that I can. My objective is to develop a model that can help decision makers plan renewable energy grids in rural areas. Now, this is a simplified scope. It limits the task that I have at hand, but at the same time, hopefully with the methods that I'm using, you'll see that there's flexibility to expand that and to capture some more opportunities for the model. So, let's talk a little bit about the present energy models that are being used today. They can be split into two main categories, normally out in the literature. One is the modeling approach. You can do top-down, which means you're going to use macro-scale indicators, statistics of a big system, and then you model the system based on that. You can do bottom-up, which means you start with micro-scale things like consumption from an appliance or consumption in a household. Then you build that up into making generalizations for a big system. There's also hybrid systems, which use a little bit of both. In general, bottom-up and hybrid systems are considered to perform better for developing countries. The other categorization that you can have is scope or the objective. These can be, three of the most popular ones are econometric, which deal with exactly what is the price of things, either energy, electricity, fuel, or appliances. Also load planning, which deal mostly with how are you going to dispatch your production units. So, in the summers, peak production, how are you going to meet that production? Investment planning, looking into the future and how are we going to have to invest to keep up with the electricity consumption that we have. And there's others out there. There's a lot of them. The problem is that these have been focused on developed countries. Actually, only about a quarter of the models out there even acknowledge developing countries. And we're talking about countries from India and China all the way down to Liberia, which I will be talking about later. And according to literature, these models don't capture the complexity that is required in a developing country. Sometimes they don't capture the complexity in a developed country because their scope narrows them into a niche. And so you have to use them for what they were made for, of course. So some of the issues that we see out there is that developing countries first are very different from developed countries. So developing countries have a very different energy system and electricity system than developed countries do. Costa Rica, for example, is a middle-of-the-ground country where about 98% of the population has access to electricity. Almost 100% of people in Costa Rica cook with either gas or electricity. So very high up in the latter fuels that we call. Liberia, on the other hand, 98% of the population cooks with charcoal. Very different situations. Costa Rica, 50 to 100 years of data are available depending on what you want to do. Liberia, nothing. 14 years of civil war, basically all you have are estimates, no data. So very different things. But some of the most, from a modeling perspective, some of the bigger issues are the fact that developing countries have a complexity that's very different from developed countries. Also, models out there have a lack of flexibility, like I mentioned, and the heterogeneity of what's happening in developing countries. So in developed countries, you normally have formal energy markets, right? In developing countries, you don't have a formal energy market. You go out, you cut some wood, you bring it home, you cook, right? No exchange, no paper trail, no nothing. Also, the present infrastructure that models assume in developed countries is not there in developing countries. So when you're talking about the big arguments with renewable energy, for example, intermittency, and how are you going to deal with intermittency in a population that is used to having electricity all the time, that is not there in developed countries. In developing countries. So you're talking about populations that have zero electricity, and if you provide electricity in the evenings, that is actually fine with a customer versus, not having electricity at all. So I think the biggest problem is that, like Einstein said, models should be as simple as possible and no simpler. And our developing countries models have not been simplified enough. Which brings me to an interesting case study that I've been using. If you were here last time I presented, a year or two ago, we were doing a GIS-based model of Liberia, which is one of the countries I'm interested in, and talking about how decision makers there are going to do the electrification process. And notice I'm talking about electrification versus energy, right? Electrification, lighting, cell phone charging, television, communications, internet, not cooking. So we decided to take a step back and try to look at this from a more generalized approach. So the case study we're looking at is Liberia, and all of you have probably seen this picture before, where you can see where there is electricity available, and there's always that little light bulb inside South Africa. But we're talking about Liberia, which is the least electrified country in the world. High rural population, over 70% of the population lives in rural areas, very low population density, and literally no existing infrastructure. There is about 5,000 customers connected to a small grid in Liberia out of 4 million people. So it brings the question, if we had a clean slate, what would we do? How would we go over this? What fuels would we use? What would the structure of the network be? What are the general practices that we would follow? And it kind of brings us to the fact that the case in Liberia is a case of rural energy planning or rural electricity planning, which happens in a lot of places in the world. India, China are all facing these situations. So this is a GIS representation of Liberia. And what I have here are the population centers placed according to the political boundaries. And you see there's this big area right here, this big house, is Monrovia, which is the capital city. is the only place that has electricity. Excuse me. Right now, the electricity in Liberia comes from diesel-powered generators, 15 1-megawatt diesel-powered generators that they turn on. Not very stable, but they're providing for about 5,000 customers, like I said. Everybody else in here does not have electricity or has small diesel generators that they use to power small enterprises. There's a few solar panels out there. But the situation is actually a little bit more complicated because this is an aggregation of the population in what they call their districts, which is kind of like our counties. If we go to the level of clans, you can see that there's actually a lot more population centers and a lot more interspersed. And the geography in Liberia is not very simple. It's mostly tropical rainforest with very few roads. Actually, you can see on this map the two main roads that are available in Liberia, one going up to Sierra Leone, one going up to Guinea and Ivory Coast. And so brings the question of, how would Liberia go about connecting all these different centers? Would they do a centralized system like this? Would they do something more decentralized like this? Basically, they have a clean slate. They haven't started anything. There are some plans, but a little bit further out. So in the hopes to try to answer this, I'm using, like I said, agent-based modeling. Some of you know what this is, but for the rest of us, agent-based modeling is basically, if you are this guy here looking at a school of sardines and trying to figure out how they behave, and this is a picture from the Monterey Aquarium. And by the way, if you've ever seen a sardine school, it looks like it's just one organism, right? And so you could think, well, maybe we can create this thing and model the whole macro system at once. And the last time I was at the Monterey Aquarium, there was one damn sardine that was swimming the opposite direction from everybody else. I was like, what the crap's wrong with this fish? So it brings up some interesting things to think about. But the point is, these schools of sardines actually respond to predators as a whole system, as an organism, a big organism. In agent-based modeling, we don't try to model the whole school. Instead, what we do is we go down to the level of one sardine, and we model that sardine, and we model how they react, and then we model all of those sardines interacting with each other. And that way, we can actually get a macro state from the micro state of the different actors in the system. This is different from equation-based models. Equation-based models are things we're more familiar with in general. These are abstractions of the world that we bring into a mathematical expression, right? They work great for things that follow physical phenomena. So, for example, how does water flow through a pipe? How does a gas react to the increase in temperature when it's in a cylinder? There are basically homogeneous actors that it focuses on, and it offers a little bit less detail than agent-based models can. Not always do, but can. Whereas agent-based models, they came from the social sciences, and so they are based on how actors make decisions. They're also very good for modeling heterogeneous actors. Sardines, sharks, different things, heterogeneous, different rules, different actions, and different ways of making decisions. And they offer very different levels of detail that we can look at, and I'll show you some examples of what I mean by that. So they offer a lot more flexibility for what I'm trying to do, and that's why I'm using these agent-based models. Let me tell you how I'm abstracting the world in general, and now I'm not just talking about Liberia, I'm just talking about developing countries in general. We have an environment, and that environment can hold things inside of it. It actually, in our case, is going to have power potential. And I'm not specifying what this power is. It's just power. It could be geothermal, it could be fossil, it could be solar. It's just power potential. In the environment, we have populations that are located around the environment. They have a demand, they have a size, they have a location. And we're going to be creating power plants that have also a capacity and that can supply those populations. And the way they're going to supply those populations is by the appearance of these electricity connections. So these electricity connections are going to link our power plants to our populations and provide the electricity. Now, outside of that environment, there's a decision maker, which I've placed outside of our environment because he's omniscient. And the reason for that is our model is trying to help decision makers make best plans. So the time scale here is kind of removed. Basically, we're assuming they're going to have access to the whole model run, and so they're kind of all-knowing. And they make decisions outside of the environment. So in software terms, this is what it kind of looks like. And this is implemented in NetLogo, which is one of the agent-based modeling softwares out there. These green triangles are populations. The yellow lightning bolt is a power plant. And so all these black space is the environment. The black space is actually divided, you can't see it right now, but it's divided into little squares that are called patches. And for our perspective, we can define the size of the patch, and I've just made it a 10 by 10 kilometers patch. And so I could actually show you where kind of the observer or the decision maker is working over here, and we'll get to that in a minute. But basically, what that observer needs to do is to make decisions. How am I going to connect these populations with the power supply that I have? So the way he makes those decisions are, first he looks around and he says, are there any dark populations? Populations that don't have any power supply. If they are, he says, well, do I have power plants available with capacity? If they are, he says, does it make economic sense? I'm sorry you can't really read that, but does it make economic sense for me to connect that population to my power plant? If it is, it goes ahead and creates a connection. If there's not, then he has to go and create more power plants. And the way he decides on those power plants can change, and we'll talk about that decision in a minute. Once all the populations are connected, he goes in and says, well, are there any populations that have not enough capacity? And if there are, which we call here incompletes, then he goes through the same decision process on how to connect them. So let's look at how he decides if there's an economically feasible connection, or if it's economically makes sense. And basically, every population in the model is saying, is there a patch that I could get enough power out of to satisfy all my demand? If not, he says, wait small, like they say in Liberia, and he becomes an incomplete, because that means no power plant is going to ever be able to provide all of its supply at once. Then it calculates the cost of connecting to a viable patch, if there is one. And that's what I call a decentralized generation cost. We have two models of electrification that are popular. Decentralized generation means you create a power plant out in Ann Arbor, and you connect all of Ann Arbor to it without connecting to the rest of the grid in Michigan. The other idea is what we have generally in the States, where you have big power plants that connect to all of these populations, and so it's basically a centralized generation or grid extension, where you are extending the grid little by little to all these populations. So the dark is also looking at, do I have somewhere a grid that's already available that I could connect to? And if so, what is my cost to doing that? And then it compares. And it says, okay, the most economically reasonable idea is for me to do decentralized generation or do grid extension. And so the decision maker looks at all of these things and he says, well, this is the next step. I'm going to connect the one that makes the most economic sense. And economic sense we can define in a different way, but for the first rounds of practice that I'm doing, we're using just total overnight capital cost. So if I was to build a plant tomorrow, how much would it cost me? Or if I was to build this connection, grid extension, tomorrow, how much would it cost me? And so basically, what this guy is doing, what this decision maker is doing, is saying, I want to use the resources I have available in the best way possible with the least cost possible until I can connect everybody in my world. Everybody. 100% electrification. And so he's got a lot of different ideas here that he can go through. One of the things is we can change how many population centers there are and how many people there are in the world. So the population. Now, the populations are spread within the agents in a exponential form. That is, there is some populations that are very large and a lot of populations that are very small, which reflects what happens in the world. Right? We have very large cities, and then we have a lot of little bitty cities. The same happens for the power potential that is available in the world. So we have a certain amount of power that we get, and it's spread in an exponential form throughout the patches. So there's a few patches that have very large power supply or power potential, and very many that have very little power supply. The other thing he can change is how does he decide where he's going to put the next project or the next power project? He can decide he's going to go for the biggest populations first, right? Which is kind of what happens in the world. You have a big city, you want to provide electricity for the big city first. He can also decide that he's going to go after the largest resource. And that happens also in the world. If we look at mega hydro projects, for example, this is that example. You know, we have Three Gorges Dam, or the new dam that's going up in Africa. I apologize, I can't remember what the name of it is. But basically, we know we have a huge power potential there. We're going to exploit it. And then I've given it something that is in the middle, just to play around with. Basically, the decision maker looks around and he says, I want to find a compromise between large power supply and proximity to a lot of people. So it goes around, it looks at all the patches and says, you know, which patch is got a good compromise between very large power supply, power opportunity, and proximity to a lot of people. So all of these things can be changed in the model so that we can run some scenario building. And the reason this model is being built, in my mind, is so that we can talk to decision makers and talk about what would the world look like now that you have these empty pallets in Liberia, for example, or in provinces in Ghana, or different countries in South America. So I did some runs to show you some of the results. Yeah. Sure.
So if I understand you correctly, the population is not in any way mobile. You have your population centers in city, they stay there. It's
Yes.
never the case that, you know, they have the opportunity to move closer to existing power sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the populations are set, the location of the populations. There is, and I'm not using it in this example, but there is an opportunity to make the populations either grow or decline. So like, once you build a village, for example, that village is there. But the people in there may move to a different village, right? Or more people may come to that village. And that is something I'm not experimenting with yet. Cool. So this is just the very basic thing. You know, what is it going to cost us depending on the population? And here we have a population going up in millions, from 1 million all the way to 100 million, which is, you know, a lot of developing countries lie there. Although we can go all the way up to, you know, the population of China. And then what the cost is just for the plant. You know, we have two different costs, and I'll show you the next cost. You can see this is just creating the plant. And that is basically a linear relationship with your population. The other cost is the transmission cost. So once I build a plant, I actually need to get that power to somebody, so I have to build high voltage lines or low voltage lines, and I have to connect them. So that's basically, in agent-based terms, the cost of the links, cost of creating the links. And you can see that those are actually not linear. You know, as the population grows, your connections are not growing linearly with the population. The other thing you can see is that it doesn't really matter which project you make first on the total cost of providing electricity for everybody. So if you start with the largest population, or if you start with a central resource, or the largest resource, it doesn't really matter. You know, it's basically the same cost. Same thing for your connection cost, except that you have a lot of these spikes on the transmission cost. And the reason for that is that if you go for the largest population first, then your network is going to be growing kind of in a more sporadic way, right? So if we went and connected first New York and Los Angeles, then trying to connect everybody else, you know, is probably more expensive than connecting a big city in the middle, like Chicago, and then just spreading out from there, okay? Now, the thing that I found interesting is the number of power plants that you have to build to provide electricity for everybody. And this is interesting because it tells us a difference between a decentralized generation mix and a centralized generation mix. Low number of power plants means I have a centralized system, right? So I created Three Gorges Dam and I connected everybody from there. So low number of power plants. High number of power plants means I have a decentralized system. I'm creating all these little power plants around everywhere. And you can see that as your population is low, it's better to have a decentralized system. So remember, this guy is actually economically making this decision. So hopefully this is economically optimal. So at low population points, it's good to have a lot of power plants. At high populations, it's good to have few power plants. And so you're basically shifting from very decentralized all the way to centralized, depending on your population. Also, you can see that if you start with the largest population, you're actually going to end up creating a lot more power plants than if you had started with a central resource or with the largest resource, which is important because, yes, this is economical, but so all of these results give you the same economic result, remember, from the previous graph.
The cost is still the same, right?
Cost is still the same. So you can see from this graph, basically the cost is still the same no matter what decision for the initial projects to place the projects are. But yet you end up with less production units. What that means, for an environmental point of view, I do work at the School of Natural Resources, so I kind of have to think about this, is that you have a lot lower footprint, right? There are smaller power plants which are going to consume lower footprints. So that means things like Three Gorges Dam, maybe you didn't need that because you could have used a lot of different smaller power plants around with smaller footprint. So that's one of the some of the results I have. The other thing I looked at was, what if you have a stable population, right? And your population, which happens in the real world, starts using a lot more electricity than you expected. So higher demand. Developing countries start around here, about 100 kilowatt hours per year. We are, per person, we are way beyond this. I think we use something like 1,500 to 3,000 kilowatt hours a year. In Liberia, it's like 50 kilowatt hours a year. So you can see here, you expected if you have, a low population, as they increase in demand, your costs goes up. If you have a high population, that's higher, your costs go up. That's kind of expected. But then we go to the required production units. And you can see here that as your population is low, the required number of power plants is higher. What that means again is that as your population is low, the number of power units tells you there's a decentralized generation scheme that is economically optimal versus a centralized generation scheme. And as your population goes up, decentralized goes to centralized, and as the demand goes up, decentralized goes to centralized. So higher number of production units indicating that there's a decentralized preference. So there is your comparison there. The other thing is that the very high population actually needs less production units until that high population starts increasing in demand. You guys see that inflection there? The question back there?
Do you consider management and daily planning cost in your model?
I'm sorry, the cost of what?
Management.
Management.
Yeah, and the daily planning cost in your model.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I do not have operation and maintenance costs on here for a couple of reasons. One is I'm assuming that there is just one power supply, let's call it black energy. But it's
decentralized decentralized model need a lot of plan. So you need a lot of people to run the plan.
That is true.
Cost is immediately high.
Yep, that is true. It does not change your building cost of the power plants, though. You see what I'm saying? But it will change my decision making. So I think I'll answer your question in a minute with what the future work is. But you're right. More plants mean more management costs, right?
The salary is very high in
Yep.
USA.
Yep.
So
Yeah, great. So this brings me to what can we do for implementing this model into a more specific model, and this goes to the flexibility of what we're building. So this is basically the model I had built before, and now what we have is a way that we can connect them together, where you load the different layers of information into your agent-based model, and your agents then have access to that information to make the decisions. And then they're going to make decisions instead of with generalized statistics. They're going to make decisions with the specific ideas, specific data from these countries. So this is the case of Liberia, where we can load the biomass potential, the wind potential, the hydro, then the actual GIS location of the population centers, and all of that goes into our model so that the decision makers can make those decisions based on the things that we're doing. And also, the decision makers can actually sit around a table with this model and play around with their decision production, the decision scenario building process. So for the future, for future work, and this goes to your question, I believe, and you can correct me, some of the things that we need to look at is, again, simpler, as simple as possible, but no simpler, is we need to include the differences in fuel because there are significant differences in cost, operation and maintenance cost, as well as overnight plant cost. Also, I want to focus on the network topology, and that talks to the geographic barriers. So just because I am close here to Gwen doesn't mean that I can reach him very fast, right? There is this desk right here. Same thing happens in rural populations. If you're sitting across the Rio Grande, you may not have electricity at all. But right across the Rio Grande, there's a jack-in-a-box all lit up, right? But you can't connect. There's political and there's geographic barriers to that network growth. Also, that brings us to the fact of resiliency and intermittency in renewable energy, which is very important for developed countries, but also for developing countries. What is the resilience of a network from decentralized generation to completely centralized generation? Does it change around it? And then develop an easy GIS interface. Right now, that is one of the issues, is being able to load GIS data into NetLogo is not as hard as you would think. But how would we be able to present that to a decision maker in Mali? How would we be able to tell them how to use these things together? And then study how these generalizations can be useful to the developed world. A GUI for the stakeholders so that they can actually build scenarios themselves. But then the other thing is decision parameters. And this goes to your question. Dollars per kilowatt hour is very different from over 90% capital cost, right? It's very cheap for you to build diesel plants all over the world because they're cheap. But they're not very cheap to maintain. They're not very cheap to operate. The fuel costs are high. So that goes to the idea of decentralized generation cost is going to have, maybe, because of maintenance, a higher cost in dollar per kilowatt hour produced. Same thing in dollars per kilowatt, because of including the operation and maintenance and the transmission costs of a decentralized versus centralized. So those are some of the parameters I'm looking to investigate. But in conclusions, I feel like the model supply is a very flexible tool so that we can do electricity planning. The scenarios give insightful, large-scale planning, and the capabilities for levels of detail are very good. The network topology can be explored, which is important when you're talking about politicians trying to connect different areas of a country. And of course, the stakeholder involvement is facilitated, whereas agent-based model, you can present something like our model like this and show them how things connect and how changing different things change the results. An equation-based model or an Excel spreadsheet model is not going to give them that flexibility and that understanding. So with that, thank you very much, and hope you have a lot of comments for me. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the population move.
Mm-hmm.
So is that currently the population can't move, right? So I'm wondering if you allow the population or a certain portion of the population to move to nearby cities with electricity, would that create some kind of positive feedback loop? Because those cities will have a huge population and then they have higher priority for future development.
Mm-hmm.
So some kind of, I don't know how much value actually that is.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and that's an interesting project to work on allowing the urbanization to be captured by the model.
Probably would happen in real life, right? If they start by, let's take the biggest city, let's put energy there, and then they have to be careful for the population to not out jump to the city.
And what I'm really interested is in the opposite scenario, where you start with smaller villages that now have opportunities, and then people might migrate back. Especially in the case of Liberia, where after the war, basically, everybody came to the city, and now they're very slowly spreading back out. So, a lot of social issues there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Could you actually go back and help me understand the different decisions that are being made by the mission agent and the actual individual actors?
Yep. So all of the decisions are being made really by the decision maker. And I'll show you the actual model. So here's the actual model. So when I set up the model, the decision maker uses this to make the decision. Okay, he's going to start with the largest population. He creates the power project in the best viable spot and connects that population. Now, everybody in the world, when I hit go, every time step, what they do is they calculate their grid extension cost and their decentralized generation cost. And then the decision maker basically says, I'm going to connect the cheapest option for the next person. And that next person is going to be the cheapest of the cheapest. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so the patch agents are sources of information, not actual autonomous.
Absolutely.
So,
They just hold information, and they will hold the power plant once it grows.
So I guess I'm a little bit confused as to why this should be an agent-based, multi-agent model, given that there's really only
Yeah, I think I think you're right, and it goes back to the question of why use an agent-based model here. Why not just use a optimization software? The reason is we want the flexibility to know how this is going to change based on where the size and the populations are, and based on how the decision maker is making the decisions. So the environment is changing, right? But that environment and the agents are changing, because each time that I hit go, for example, of course now he's not going to do
So
it.
you have a time evolution instead of just the final.
Exactly. So now this guy is connected to the network. So that changes the state of all of these agents that are close to him, right? Because now this guy, his cost for grid extension just changed by the fact that this guy is connected to the grid.
Yeah. So every time you run this model, you get the same result for the same initial conditions.
No, we can see that very quickly. Same initial conditions. There's a random. Of course, he's going to crash now. Same initial conditions, because every time we set up the model, there is a different layout of the populations, where they are, what their demand is, and all that.
But
kind
if you set the populations in the same places,
I don't know. Haven't tried that. It's possible.
right?
Once you set, I imagine that once you set the population, the guy is making the best decision possible. That's always something to say.
Yeah. I just wonder if it's worth it to build it in that way, or if you aren't trying to incorporate some stochastic element that, you know, that the feedback of that you need to capture.
That's true. And we've thought a lot about that, and we actually have done something similar for the case of Liberia, where the stochastic part there is we don't know exactly how much each person consumes, right? So there's always some kind of stochasticity going on. But that's a really good point. We haven't actually done just using an optimization of the system.
The stochastic point could come, for instance, like a random chance of this guy moving to another city that has, if he starts doing
Yeah,
that.
that's the feedback that
The feedback part is, if the city starts to get energy, you have this probability of someone moving to the city or something.
Yeah.
I think the setup is already ready. Can I ask you a question, like pushing you completely outside of your field, but just in the spirit of complex systems?
Yeah.
Can we get anything from these into trying to understand other sources of energy, like in animals who have just one heart that is giving us, all the energy, and it's not really known whether this is the best that we could get, or would it be better to have two hearts, one just for the brain, one for the rest, or
I think
it's
that's
just something that came from evolution because you have one organism that is sourcing both with one heart.
I think that's a really cool question, and actually, Breland and I are training for a triathlon, and one of the big things that we always wonder is, should you kick during a swim, or should you save your legs completely for the next stages? And it's kind of the same question, right? Is should you use everything, or should you have 4 motors versus just 2, or it's possible. I haven't carried it all the way there, but it's a really good question. Yeah. Yeah.
Question I thought of was I don't know, do people have a preference whether they want a power plant right nearby, or they just want connection to the grid?
That's a great question, the not in my backyard type of question. And, I haven't looked into what the preferences are of the local communities. One evolution of the model that we've thought about is where there is no decision maker other than so all of the populations make the decision. So they may decide because of preference, we just want wires, but they may decide no, we want to have it right here, or so I haven't implemented that. But that's a great question.
Because one thing to that is you mentioned like bigger power plants have higher footprint, and smaller ones might be a better choice, and also like the emission from a huge power plant would be higher, and just the thinking you could kind of integrate how would that impact the nearby population.
Yeah.
Or decision.
Yeah, and that's a great question, especially because it changes with the fuel source, right? I mean, if it's a coal plant, they're probably less likely to want it right next door, whereas if it's a hydro plant or I don't know, solar station, they might feel differently. Yes.
So I just wondering how you choose the location for the power plant. So is it based on the population or based on the network?
So it depends on the decision process here. So if we use the largest population, then the decision maker looks at the largest population and finds out where the cheapest viable patch is for them, including transmission and building cost. If we use the largest resource, then he actually looks at all the patches and finds out who's got the most power promise available. And then we have, the largest sorry, I talked about that one. And then the central one where the decision maker actually, I don't think Mark Newman is here, so I can use this word, centrality. He actually looks at what I call centrality. Don't tell Mark Newman I'm using that. He basically looks at each patch, how far it is from all of the people, and normalizes it to how much resources he's got. So it basically gives the observer an opportunity to decide, which is the most promising patch to connect everybody or the most people possible to the largest resources possible. So it depends on the decision key that I'm using here.
Okay.
As a
It's
change.
like the number of the power plant.
The number of power plants is decided by the model run. At the end of the model
You
run.
define the number of the power plant.
No. The decision maker does, because he's building power plants using that decision making process until everybody's connected. So that's in a completely decentralized scheme, he may have to build 50 power plants, one for each population center.
So a lot of the time, I guess, because of political or social concerns, you can't. It's infeasible a lot of the time to try and focus on one strategy for building something that might be the best in some sense. Have you thought about like mixed strategies, like go for largest population some of the time, and then the other, and then consider what would happen if you were like switch from largest population, if you had to sort of switch from largest population to centrality based on some sort of, you could consider like local politics or something like that as sort of like a way of switching between those two. Talking about like general mixed strategies and getting statistics for that.
That's a great question. I have not thought about doing mixed strategy. I'll definitely put it down. One thing we have thought about is political. I'm not sure what political scientists call this, but just trying to get more pork, I guess is the word, where you're going to build a power plant close to a community that you want you to support you. So there's an opportunity there to add some probability that a decision maker will actually veer off his decision path to do that. And so that's one easy way I've thought of playing with this, but mixed strategy is a good thought. Yeah.
Back to the question of footprints, you could do something like each patch has an intrinsic value of the nature of the patch or something that's destroyed when you put the power plant on.
Yeah.
And I guess that could also vary by power source, whether it's flooding a park or putting up a pole.
Yeah. That's a great idea too, intrinsic value. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have any conjecture as to why there's a triangle there? There's two power
Yeah.
plants in
These guys? Well, when this happens, basically there is a resource, a patch that has a lot of potential. And so you end up building a bigger power plant and connecting it to these populations through separate lines. So basically here what could have happened is this guy ended up, and you probably can't see it here very well, but he's not really part of this network. So the decision maker built this plant and found that this connections were easier. And later, when he was running out of possibilities, he had to connect these populations to this plant because he no longer had capacity. And it happens usually in the largest population cases. If you use the largest resource, usually you don't see that. You see a little bit more of a.
Well, why would he attach to the, there's the whole branching part that's much closer geographically. Why did he not tap into the shift the load, down the network?
I don't have a rewiring mechanism there, so because the power plant ran out of capacity, then it just does what he needs to do and then continues on. The others were less priority. And it's actually, funny enough, it's something that happens a lot. It's where you see, these random big, especially when you're trying to create largest populations first, you have this random big old power line. Is actually happening in Liberia right now. They're building a power line that goes from Guinea all the way to the border. To Monrovia. So if you look at the map, maps, they're basically building this line right here. Actually, all the way from over here, all the way to Monrovia. And there's like 10 different little villages underneath there that are not getting any electricity at all. They're not. And it's just not, it was not in the linear programming that the World Bank was using. And so it's basically happens a lot. So you would have to go back and build a substation there, to bring down the voltage and actually provide it to the village if you wanted to do that. So it'd be a wasted energy source there. Cool. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed your lunch.